logo is. I think it's a very exciting one. The theme that I'm going to have for my remarks today, my brief remarks, is a theme that we picked up. If you've been paying attention to the wine business news, it's about the need to adapt. It occurs to me that Rob McMillan in the Silicon Valley report, his theme was adaptation. And at the Unified, Jeff Bitter, the head of the Allied Grape Growers, our grower representative, his word of the year was adapt. And the wine world needs to adapt in many ways. There's many dimensions of adaptation that are needed. In production and consumption, we need to adapt to changing preferences. We need to adapt to changing lifestyles. And so let me start off with sort of organizing this analysis of change around the old Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Or if you were to watch the Italian language version, Il Buono, Il Brutto, and Il Cattivo, the good, bad, and the ugly. So let me start off with this chart from OIV, which is sort of the United Nations of wine. And this is a chart of worldwide wine production by volume for the last 23 years. And this is my good news picture, although it's not going to look like it when you take a look at it. In 2023, by the most recent estimates, global wine production was the lowest that it's been in 50 years. Wow. For 50 years, that takes us back to the 1970s. A really sharp declines, as you can see, in global wine production. Now, why is that? Why is global wine production so low? Well, typically, if you look at the ups and downs in this picture, typically it's about weather, about where if there was great growing weather for most of the big producer countries in the world, then wine production is very high. And when there is bad weather, and there's always bad weather somewhere, but when there's bad weather in several of the major wine producing regions of the world at the same time, then it goes. So this is partly something about cycles and global weather, but that's not what made this big decline in 2023 so strong. That was because not of supply, not weather affecting supply, but that was adaptation. That was wine producers, grape growers reducing production to deal with the fact that demand has declined, producing a smaller volume of wine because of the smaller amount of wine. How do they do this? Well, of course, there's lots of ways, but my agents around the world in 2023 reported in Australia seeing vast acreage of grapes simply left on the vine and not harvested. My agents in Rioja saw it in Spain, and in Tuscany saw it in Italy. And the most recent grape report from California puts this into context. The sort of kind of good news that they reported is that California harvested about 3.7 million tons of grapes. Can you imagine? 3.7 million tons of grapes, up from about 3.3 million the year before. So the good news, if you want to, side of that was that it was a little more wine produced, not quite as short a crop. But if you looked at the footnotes, you discovered that 3.7 million, but they think that maybe more than 4.1 or 4.2 million tons of grapes were on the vines. They figured that between 400,000 tons and 500,000 tons of grapes were simply left on the vines to rot. It wasn't even worth paying to have them harvested, machine harvest or anything. So this is a good news picture only because it shows that the initial adaptation to this changing world of wine is underway. This is the bad news picture. I used to call it Wine's Lost Decade, and that's the title of the slide here. But in fact, it's more than a decade now, and it's not just lost, is something more. Go back to about 2020 or earlier than that in the 1990s, and if you planted your vineyard there or started your winery then, you were in the golden age. Wine grape growing, wine consumption was just rising again and again and again. And many of us back in those days thought it would continue at this fantastic trend and go forever. And it would be up here by 2023 and 2024. But it didn't last. Then came the global financial crisis in about 2008, 2009, and wine consumption fell. But we thought that's just the global financial crisis. When the crisis goes away, growth will come back. But it didn't come back. Instead, it sort of kicked around and was stagnant for about 10 years. That's the lost decade part of this. And then it began to decline again and again. And this bad news picture is actually even worse than it looks, because some of this increase in demand that we see in this segment of the graph was due to rapidly growing wine consumption in China. And many of us thought that China was going to be the engine of growth that would pull the global wine economy along in the face of declining consumption, especially in Western Europe. But no, after COVID especially, wine consumption in China has dropped off the table. And so this is going down. So this is bad news. This is what we have to adapt to. We have to adapt to the fact that wine has kind of lost its mojo. It's just the constantly growing global consumption of wine that seemed like it would raise all boats. Well, that tide is out. And so we have to adapt a little better. So that's the good news and bad news. This isn't exactly the ugly news. It's just confusing. It confuses me, I'll tell you. And that is that the preferences for wine globally and then within each country, of course, are changing rather dramatically. And I'll show you some more examples of this in just a little bit and some ideas of why. But the OIV has started to keep track of wine preferences in terms of just the color of the wine. The wines that are red wine and white wine, and then down here at the bottom, rosé wine. Rosé wine looks like a real flat picture, but if you scale that up, you'll see that there's been some interesting activity going on. The OIV later this week, you tune into their website, they are doing a more in-depth analysis of changing wine preferences in terms of varieties and color and so forth. Well, we're used to it for a long time now. We've been used to the idea that red wine sells better than white wine. Red wine is more expensive than white wine, and you sort of get your reputation with red wine, blah, blah, blah. You get that. So what a surprise that just in the last 10 years, white wine, from a global standpoint, in terms of volume, value would be a little different. In terms of volume, white wine has actually risen and now has greater sales globally than red wine. If you do what they do in French supermarkets and you put the white wines and the rosé wines together on the shelf, you would find that shelf dwarfs the red wines that are there. And so people are changing how much wine they buy. They're changing separately how much they're willing to pay for it. And then they're also changing what they buy. And so that's a lot of change. That's a lot to try to adapt to. If you were regrafting your vineyard today, what would you do? What would you plant? What would you do in thinking about the future? We are not alone in having to adapt to change. We used to think that if wine was declining, then beer, especially maybe craft beer, that was the answer. But beer is declining too. It's changing too. Betty Brager, our consumer and market analysis guru, gave me this stunning fact at the Unified. If you go to a Whole Foods store and look around, what's the best-selling beer? And the answer is, it's best-selling beer brand in Whole Foods is Athletic Brewing Company, which is 100% non-alcoholic beer. So beer drinkers are changing, and they're changing to low alcohol, but especially no cognac and tequila surged during the pandemic, and now they're both in decline. Tequila market is so soft at the moment that the Financial Times of London reported that agave producers in Mexico were hesitating to sign contracts for the next 7 years because they just didn't know if the tequila market was going to be there. Even luxury goods, non-alcoholic goods, these surged in demand for luxury goods in general, surged during the pandemic. And now, unless you're at the very top, unless you're Cartier or you're selling Birkin bags, which I had to learn what a Birkin bag was, only at the very top, only at the top of the pyramid of luxury goods is the demand still there. People are changing what they buy, how they buy it. It's really very strange. To some of the lessons we got from the Unified, what's hot, I say hot-ish, because these days, 5 years ago, hot meant, oh, we're selling at high single digits, low double digits rate of growth. In 2024, hot-ish means that you're kind of holding steady. That's the new term for hot. So $15 to $25, they're holding steady, gaining in value, even if it's iffy in terms of volume. $10 and below, oh man, that's a dead zone. Very difficult. Unless you're selling 3-liter box wines, more than $4 per bottle equivalent. That market is actually growing, but for bottle wines, inexpensive bottle wines, not so good. White wines doing well. Red and pink, not so bad, or not so good. Red especially, not very good. Pink almost holding its own. Wines from France and New Zealand, they're hottest because of their emphasis on red wines. Red wines from Australia and Argentina, not so much. A hottish element, low and no wines, and sweet wines. Do you see that label in the center there? Oh, what's not so hot? Syrah and Moscato. Even though it's a white one, Moscato seems to have come up. I'm kind of become fascinated, and you'll see why in a second, with Stella Rosa. Stella Rosa is the Riboli family winery from Southern California, and these are imported low alcohol wines imported from Italy. They're semi-sweet, they're low alcohol, and they are not afraid of flavoring. And so one of their brands that I promised myself to try, but I haven't yet, is pineapple and chili flavored wine. It's semi-sweet, it's a little bit sparkling. It's what someone wants to drink, and they want to drink quite a lot of it. I wanted to dig down deep just a little bit. And so Danny Brager gave me permission to use a couple of his slides to show you something about how the market is changing and why why that picture of market change is ugly or confusing to me, because it's hard to know exactly what to do. It's going to be know your market, know where you sell your wine, and try to use the micro data in addition to this macro data. So here's a picture of where growth is and isn't. And here we go. So Danny has these complicated slides, but they tell so much, and I just can't believe it. And so if you look at the bars on this graph, the bars show the share for different grape varieties, the share of the market, where Denny defines the market as $11 and up, and wines that go through the 3-tier system. So wines in distribution. These will be largely the supermarket and wine shop sort of wines. So look at the bars. The biggest share of the market goes to Cabernet Sauvignon. You won't be surprised at that. And next biggest share, Chardonnay. This is by volume. It would be different by value. After Chardonnay, it's Sauvignon Blanc. And then red blend, whatever that means, Pinot Noir, and everything else is pretty small except for rosé over here. So if we look at where the market is it's Cabernet, it's Pinot Noir, red blends, and then Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay. All right, so that's in the center here. This area in the center, that's where the bulk of the market is. Now, where is the growth? All right, for the growth, you look at the green dots, and you look over here at the growth rate in the last year. The fastest growing segment, which is about 10% annual growth, is for a tiny share of the market, white blends, about holding steady, Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, about holding steady, all right, Sauvignon Blanc. Everything else, man, it's not growing, it's declining. And the biggest parts of the market, Cabernet Sauvignon, red blends, Pinot Noir, are declining by more than 5% by volume over the year. And so, where will you invest? It's a really difficult situation. The old surefire, you can't decide what to plant. You plant Chardonnay or Cabernet. You know, that's not a very good strategy in 2024 based on the current state of the market. More and more, Jeff Bitter talking to growers, more and more he's talking about looking at varieties that can be used in a multiple ways. For example, this year he was talking about GSMs, Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, but especially the Mourvèdre and Grenache as wines that would maybe have a market for themselves as varietal wines, but would be very useful in various sorts of blends and to distinguish themselves, and white wines as well. It seems like other varieties are worth a risk on this. So the lesson here is that the conventional wisdom in the past is not performing very well in 2024. And why is that? Well, one more complicated slide for you. And is part of that is because of the generation gap. Those big segment wines, the Cabernet, the Chardonnay, for example, well, they got to be so big because they were the wines that baby boomers would look for on the shelf. And we're learning very quickly that younger generations don't necessarily drink the same wines as the older generations did. In fact, many of them, as you know, aren't drinking wine at all or drinking alcohol. So here's another one of Danny's very interesting but slightly complicated pictures. And somebody did, he said, what are younger wine drinkers? So ages 21 to 34. How does their wine consumption compare to the entire wine drinker population? You know, what wine drinkers age 21 and up, so including the baby boomers now, and maybe especially including the baby boomers here. So it's an index. Now, if the index is 100, well, like for example in sparkling wine, the index is 98. Well, that means that young drinkers, 21 to 34, are drinking about the same a share as the population overall. You know, so that in the case of sparkling wines, including domestic sparkling wines and champagne and imports and so forth. In the case of domestic sparkling wines, young wine drinkers are about the same profile as wine drinkers overall. You see down here, they're a little ahead of the overall wine drinking population for Cava, and just a little ahead of the overall population in the case of Prosecco. So they drink sparkling wines. They drink sparkling wines at about the same proportions as the other wine drinking population. So with that idea of 100, let's look at domestic table wine. Domestic table wine is not as popular with younger drinkers. They only drink it 65% of the proportion of the population overall. Rosé, yeah, will drink rosé, port, sherry, and dessert wine. So there's that Swedish wine a little bit. Table wine, no. Rosé a little more. Specialty wines a little more. French whites, well, a little more. Spanish reds. This is very interesting to me because Spanish reds are off the table for many older drinkers now. Rioja is having bankruptcies in their wine sector, but young drinkers are appealed to them. Among three brands that are important, Josh is Josh is maybe the best performing wine brand in the U.S. right now of premium wine. The younger generation, Josh just isn't cutting it with them. La Marca Prosecco, this is the Prosecco that is distributed by the Gallo Company. They are disproportionately consuming La Marca Prosecco. And then here, look at Stella Rosa, the Swedish wine, the pineapple and chili wine, and other sweet and semi-sweet wines. Stella Rosa, very popular for this younger set. The question in my mind is Stella Rosa for younger drinkers today, is that like Boone's Farm and Bartles and James was for old guys like me? I don't know, but we can hope that it might be the case. So younger drinkers are not following in the footsteps of their parents and grandparents. It's a different way. And think about these types of wines that seem to have a disproportionate interest. Well, the Wine Economist this week is built around the theme of a Robert Frost poem, "The Road Not Taken." It seems like we've been doing many of the same things over and over again for many years, and it's been less and less successful. Attempts to stimulate demand by telling similar stories, producing similar wines, packaging them in similar ways. These aren't having an effect, and it makes sense that they would not, doing the same thing and expecting different results. So at the point where we need to take the road we've been ignoring so far, we need to begin to look creatively on how we must adapt to change. People are doing it now. There's a world of change out there. On the trade floor at the Unified, there was this cautious optimism that was contagious. And that cautious optimism, accepting the need to adapt, embracing change, well, that's why I hope this was, if it wasn't a dessert speech, wasn't a dessert talk, I hope it at least wasn't a complete indigestion talk too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I think we actually have a question for you. Have you found that wine preferences may change as wine drinkers age? I know that when I was younger, I preferred white, fruitier wines, but gravitated towards bolder and more complex reds as I got older.
Yep, I think that's it. I don't know the science on that, but from personal experience, especially, I think it's very true. Which is why a lot of baby boomers are now less the big Napa cab with all those tannins, and maybe a little more the Pinot Noir, less Bordeaux and more Burgundy. So I agree with that. And I think there is research to support that. So drink up your old big cabs.
And it looks like we just got another one in. With many big wine growing regions getting advice to take out thousands of acres of vines, should small growing regions also start ripping out vines?
And there, it depends on the market where you're selling them. Jeff Bitter asked California growers to pull out 30,000 net acres this year. In Washington State, I guess we figured we need to pull out 10,000 acres, which is a fifth, I think, of our total on this. but no, it depends on if you can sell them. If because Idaho, you have a different market. You are not in California grocery stores, yeah. And so I do think that, and this is channeling Jeff Bitter, that if you've got old vineyards that aren't producing as well, then you need to be thinking about um, uh, maybe it's time to retire that or to regraft onto a grape variety that is more likely to be popular in 4 or 5 years. So I think it's good to ask the question: am I growing the right things? In some cases it'll be grapes aren't the right thing, but in some cases it'll be I've got the wrong grape varieties for the emerging market.
Thank you. And just a couple more I think we have time for. I am noticing a major push from the non for profit and a variety of GO and NGOs, in parentheses, CDC, WHO, NIH, and various medical journals are shifting their focus from cigarettes as the global health issue to alcohol. Is this just my echo chamber, or are you seeing similar trends in the neo prohibition space?
No, you're exactly right. You are exactly right. And this was the most discussed topic in the hallways at the Unified this year. It is in Europe, of course, the anti-alcohol movement has been gearing up for years. A few years ago in Europe, uh, uh, producers, producer organizations from a bunch of different nations banded together and created an organization called Wine in Moderation to try to tell the positive story of wine as part of a healthy lifestyle, to try to counteract the uh, the the, the barrage of negative news and so forth. The most recent WHO World Health Organization announcement that even a glass of wine a week would be bad for your health. Boy, that shakes us all up. And so I think there's going to be consequences of this. There's a lot of thought being given to how we can tell our story in a way that the law allows us to tell our story. But no, it's not your echo chamber. We have a health problem, a perceived health problem, and we need to adapt to that new prohibitionist environment.
All right, thank you. And then last question, what's your best guess for the next big thing in wine?
Let's see. The I would think Idaho wines will be the next big thing in wine.
Good answer, Mike.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. Ashley, do you want to take it away?